Hello and welcome to a new series I will be conducting. This is going to be a sort of overarching series of debates where I will go over specific topics like politics, the environment, so and so. And this week I have my friend Damian. He runs a political blog called The Illusion of Democracy. He is currently studying political science and economics. And this week's topic we will be discussing is pretty broad and basic. It's just, should you get into politics? And today we're going to be discussing the reasons, our theses on it, and yeah, feel free to introduce yourself.
Yeah, so basically everything he said, well, I don't think there's much more to add. I'm currently studying quantitative economics with a minor in political science. Hoping to go to graduate school, and today we're just going to be talking about whether you should get involved in politics as an American citizen, given the current climate. And I'm going to be arguing for pro, and we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, so my thesis on this subject has pretty much remained the same throughout like maybe 2 or 3 years now. I'm under the impression that politics is not worth getting into at all. You have a lot more time to dedicate your uh, thought processes and analysis to, and I don't think politics is worth it as a hobby, a medium, or anything to dedicate a large amount of time to because there are people paid to worry about that is pretty much why I tend to not like citizens' involvement. I think citizens of America should be obliged to acknowledge the existence of politics, but not be obliged to join any political discussion if they choose not to, because it kind of takes away from the individualistic tendencies of people, and I really think that things like politics are not for everybody, and people like to live in ignorance of the things around them, so it's not a necessary agenda for them to carry out.
Okay. Well, I'll just state my thesis before refuting anything. My thesis is that even in this toxic political climate, I feel like that we have to view politics as an extension of our own lives instead of something that is separate. I believe that what happens in DC very well affects what happens at our homes, and I understand. I can actually understand many of the points he previously stated with regarding. I could say, let me just state myself. I believe that politics now is very toxic. It's disgusting. There's a lot of lies, and the candidates are not ideal this year. I don't think anyone is happy except a few truly deluged, like people that are truly no understanding of what's going on in our country and how serious um, we're really heading towards a global catastrophe, given the current dangers of climate change. Um, my Going back to my thesis, I really believe that regardless of this toxic climate, I feel like people should dedicate themselves just a little bit, not maybe not their lives, but they should understand that who they vote for, and whether they go out to protest, and that these things seriously make change, and that's how change starts from the bottom to the top. And I believe that that's my reasons for political participation. I believe that the more Americans were involved in the process, we would be seeing serious change, instead of just kind of this stagnation that we've seen really since the 70s, so for over 50 years.
So I think where we should start this is really discussing the past of American politics and what it meant to be a part of politics before this climate kind of evolved into what it is today. So my understanding of politics, maybe back in the 40s or 50s, was solely attributed to pleasing the nuclear family and obliging the whims of a rather conservative people who um, just suffered, hardship from the war, depression and stuff like that is is abundant sometimes. And politics, what meant being in politics, I think back then, was to be a part of the system of like not oppression as now is described most of the time these days, but
Mhm.
system of progression instead.
Hmm.
I think that society really understood what politics meant back then and what it means to them as an American and how it affects their lives, as to compared to now, of course. And a lot of Americans back in that time period, they had to go through presidents like JFK and Truman and stuff like that. It's not like they had the greatest presidents of all times back then, or the greatest judiciary, or it's it's more as though the American society understood what it meant, what their purpose was in American government.
Yeah, I actually agree with you there. I think that well, this is gonna be a little biased. Like I'm just gonna make it clear that I am predominantly a leftist person. I did vote for Bernie Sanders. I'm not a by any means a centrist or a Republican. But with that being said, I'll make some points about politics in the 50s and the 60s. Actually, were actually drastically different, and there I agree with you. Um, what we saw in those time periods were times of great prosperity amongst the predominantly amongst the lower and the middle class. People were actually living great lives, and this is not coming from some radical communists. This is just generally speaking, the standard of living was higher. People were enjoying their lives. If you worked a job, you can enjoy a decent life, and I believe that. And going back to the presidents, they've had their flaws, but given more recent presidents, we've seen dramatic changes for the worse. And I believe that these dramatic changes have come actually as a result of interference within our political system by corporate power and by essentially what I would argue, maybe not on topic, but an oligarchy where we have these very wealthy people, very wealthy families and interests, and they're meddling within the politics of the American people. And going back to my main thesis is that I believe that if more people became aware of if more people became involved in the political process, it would put serious pressure upon our representatives to maybe not accept money from these private interests, or not maybe not follow their demands, because the system we live in now is based on campaign financing. The government doesn't give any of these public representatives any money to run ads. They give them very little money to run for an election. So these figures have to constantly rely on big PACs, super PACs, and private power and private money, excuse me. And this has created a system where we have these incumbents like, let's take Nancy Pelosi. I think she's in her 80s and she's been in politics forever because she has the private interest and they keep backing her up for every primary, for every general election. And this is how change is never implemented. So yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree on some level of your sentiment towards that type of thing. But what it really comes down to is like in that time period, getting into politics and wanting to be in politics was kind of essential to the kind of nuclear family that was advocated for greatly by everyone. It was a general idea, essentially. I mean, I think that's kind of irrefutable at that point because,
Mhm.
you know, but this also led to a lot of ideas in the later periods of American history. Not later, as in, but like 60s and 70s, where a lot of African Americans were unable to gain housing because of this type of thinking and stuff like that. And a lot of people still like to be in politics, even though there was this growing problem arising. And
Mhm.
as we traversed uh, history and look back on certain events, uh, I think there was one event where houses were built on top of contaminated land, and there was a Supreme Court case on that. What can you verify that?
I know the context there. I'll look it up. You can keep talking.
Anyway, my point on that was essentially like being a part of politics and being a part of this decisions, like whether it's constitutional to build housing on top of contaminated land without acknowledging the price, or I think that was the problem at hand in that case. Being a part of that was a pleasure for the American people to be a part of something that actually afflicted their lives, and they could
Hmm.
foresee and they could physically see and tangibly
Change.
hold sometimes
Hmm.
the problem at hand.
Yeah, yeah. If you don't mind, I'll add on to that. I feel like this is the heart of. I think we're coming a lot in agreement that back then, I think that we really saw some pro- imp- implementations of some serious programs that Americans still enjoy today, which some of which are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Um, these may not these institutions have their problems, but they're still widely popular amongst the American people. And when they were first implemented, let's take under LBJ, I think it was Medicare, for so that people above the age of 65 couldn't actually go to a doctor for basically free. This was life changing because the mortality rate was. I mean, I can't be. I think I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but I feel like there was a lot of poverty amongst the elderly because they didn't save it for their retirement, and there was also an unhealthy elderly. They didn't have money for insurance. So what Social Security and Medicare did together was essentially almost eliminate poverty amongst the elderly population. And I think this is important because it goes back to our point on people when they get involved with politics, they want to see something come out of it. And this is something that hasn't happened in the last, I would argue, 50 years. And I actually think something has come out of it. And what has come out of it is terrible things. We saw what happened in '08. We saw what happened in the tech bubble burst. These things are, these stock market crashes have destroyed the lives of tens of millions of Americans. These economic recessions, even the one that we're living in now, are absolutely devastating, and a lot of them can be traced back to the disastrous deregulation, which is done behind the backs of many people. Because deregulation is not popular amongst the American people. There's no proof that it actually improves the economy. In fact, it actually can make it more wobbly. But getting back to my point that I believe that the reason these things happen in our government is because there's suppression of facts. The media chooses to report on things. They kind of there's this is kind of a hypothesis written by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky in the book Manufacturing Consent. How the media, which is now almost like a monopoly, where we live in a monopoly where five companies own 90% of all the media, and people talk about state media, but we need to talk about private and corporate media because this is just as terrifying, and it's seriously affecting the opinions
Okay,
and the
save that for
thoughts.
when we get to the present. I think because we're still in the
Yeah,
past right now. We're focusing on 40s, 50s, and
yeah,
60s right now. So I think we can move past that and move more towards 70s, 80s, and 90s now.
yeah. You
So
want me? Yeah, you can
you
go.
can start on that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'll love to. Yeah, I think the '70s is really this is really where things went downhill because the '50s and '60s were times of great prosperity. Our tax rates were different. The social programs that were implemented in the '60s were serious. I mean, this is probably the most radical time in American history, unfortunately, because the bills, the Civil Rights Bill, the Voting Rights Bill, Medicare, all these programs that are implemented, we still live by today. And then and not to mention the political participation, especially amongst the young people against the Vietnam War. I mean, we were seeing some real democracy at play in America. And then what happened in the '70s was, and there's actual White House documents, declassified White House documents, where they've briefed Nixon and Jimmy Carter about what these corporate oligarchs called an excess of democracy, and they described what happened in the '60s. Basically, we can't let this happen again. This is a serious problem because actually people actually have a say over the policy of our country, and most of the time the policy of the country in the interest of the very wealthy. And I know this is again coming from a leftist, but this is actually true. This is actually what they wrote. These corporate owners, these CEOs, CFOs, they actually briefed the presidents talking about an excess of democracy and how it's basically this excess of democracy baloney which they fed to the president. And it's not that they fell for it, but they become more influenced by by, like I said earlier, about campaign financing and all this money coming into politics. And just to wrap up my point, this doesn't mean in the 50s and 60s we still had private power, still had a pretty big say in politics, but nothing like what we see today. And I don't want to jump to the present yet, of course, but what I'm saying is that in the 50s and 60s, the corporations and the media, they all had a say in politics. But in the 70s and the 80s, we've seen like, if you can just imagine, kind of tilt like between the people and the, like, guess, let's just call them the top 1%. The amount of power that the top 1% has gained since the 70s is enormous, almost to the point where an average American can't have influence over politics, and then they drop politics. They don't even want to touch it anymore because
Yeah.
yeah, you can go from there. You can point
So
your
one of the major things I like to analyze about the 70s is kind of all the acts that are uh, kind of overlooked nowadays, like some things like the Racketeer Influence and Corruptions Organization Act, or RICO, has pretty much changed our criminal justice system. Something like, I don't know, the Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act.
Mhm,
These
mhm.
types of things still meant that the American people were, or the American government and the people still were on the same page when it came to civil problems at
Mhm,
hand, and they understood what that meant,
mhm.
right? And you really
Yeah.
have a still a connection between, as I said, the government and the people understood that still.
Mhm,
But as we progress through the 70s and up to the 80s, we begin to see disconnects and we begin to see chinks in the armor, I should say, of
yeah, yeah,
how we interpret our our place in the United States
yeah.
government and how our influence will be changing over time.
Yeah, yeah, and no, and like, and not just to add on, it's not like as soon as it went from 1969 to 1970s, everything changed. You're definitely right. There was still some in the early 70s, especially. There was still some great acts Nixon passed. Even I forgot the exact name. Forgive me, but the Environmental Act, which we still,
Yeah, I think it's
yeah,
called the it's not the Agricultural Act, it's the Clean Air Act extension.
yeah, and like that's still a good act, and but it's also important to understand, Nixon, like Republicans in the 60s are arguably what Democrats are now. I mean, our political spectrum has shifted to the right as a result of this private interest. But I guess, if you don't mind, do you want to just move on to the 80s, and then I can
Yeah,
kind of,
most of
yeah,
the 70s consisted of just like a bunch of passing of acts and stuff like that. So
yeah,
it really takes off in the 80s where
80s, yeah, oh, for
we
sure.
so do you want to start on that or
Yeah, definitely. I think, well, obviously being a leftist, I think Reagan was just a catastrophic leader, catastrophic president. Well, first we can start off with his. There's just so much to cover with Reagan, but since I'll try to stick to the thesis as much as possible, I feel like the first thing Reagan really did, I think the most really dangerous thing he did was Reaganomics. I feel like this has maybe has had the strongest impact in destroying American politics, because we've seen um, we've seen Reagan crush labor unions. We've seen him crush worker rights. We've seen the mass deregulation. I mean, this was like a party for the wealthiest people, and and again, this is all under corporate power, and it's all under the name that the economy will prosper, and that when the economy prospers, then everyone prospers, which has been proven wrong by many economists, such as Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel winning Nobel Prize, sorry, winning economist. But it's just not true. It's not true that there was greater prosperity amongst Americans. Wages have been stagnant since for almost 50 years now, and and the reason I say Reaganomics is because people just, I mean, just the worker security has gone down. People don't have time to participate in politics. They don't know where they're going to get their next meal from, and and people are starting to feel like the government is no longer there for them. And it's also important to mention with Reagan, the essentially his propaganda campaign that and I know propaganda is a term used very loosely, but I'll use it here just for the sake of discussion, that the government is bad, and that the government is insufficient, and that the government is this. And ironically, Reagan talking about small government increases military spending, drives us into a deficit. But my main point is this: the propaganda campaign is that government is bad, that these social programs are bad, that regulation is bad because they put shackles on the capitalist market, the free market, which would roar in success if they were taking it off. And the problem with that is it may be true that some deregulation will improve the economy, some, very little, but for who? And the answer is for the very wealthy. While the very wealthy get richer with these deregulations, the poor, the middle class doesn't see much of a increase in their wages. They don't really benefit from this. And yeah, you can go off from there. Yeah,
Yeah,
sorry, I'm
so
just kind of.
my major thing is obviously I used to like Ronald Reagan. Actually, he was my favorite president at one point until I obviously changed my mind about it.
Yeah.
Um, I think that obviously credit where credit is due. He pretty much changed the way the president interacts with the people and created basically a new era for political communication in the United States. I mean, I think you can agree with that. I mean, JFK popularized just being a like young charismatic figure and using the elements of technology to his advantage sometimes. But
Mhm.
Ronald Reagan really took that to another level on some level at least.
Yeah. Oh, I feel like Reagan. I mean, we got to remember Reagan won by blowout elections. Like he was
Yeah,
extremely popular amongst the American people, but I feel like his popularity was
took a turn for the worse when he got himself involved in the Cold War and went against the hippies essentially.
well, yeah, and I feel like a lot of things like Reagan has done is for again for the corporate power, and the reason he's been able to do them is because of the corporate media as well. But I won't. I'll try to stay away from my leftist talking points. I think the issue with Reagan was that people didn't just this is the problem with the political process. People don't know what's really going on behind the scenes. I feel like the people
Well,
we're
obviously,
talking.
after getting burned by Nixon, anyone would probably be
Yeah,
questioning,
yeah, 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 yeah. Well, not just that, but the issue. I think even bigger issues than Watergate. I'm talking about interference in Central America. I'm talking about the war on
jailing
drugs.
system, you know.
Yeah, yes, yes. And these things happen, and they're very, very, very serious. These things deserve lots of media attention.
By the
But
way, sorry,
yeah.
if you guys didn't know, there's a certain uh reason why our jails today are so unbelievably unjust, I should say.
Mhm.
You can be put away for marijuana possession for like months on end, and that's all due to presidents in this era. You know, Clinton, obviously. I think there was an act he passed.
With
Uh,
the three strikes.
yeah, the
Is that what?
three
Yeah.
strikes. Yeah,
Terrible. Absolutely awful.
pretty much defines our prison systems today, and this is all happening around this period. But you know, uh,
Hmm.
at its core, the '80s is a turning point for the United States for
Yes.
in combination with the American people.
Yeah. Yeah.
The
For sure.
American people are essentially uh, questioning whether they should be in the United States government and the political conversation because of obviously stuff that's going on behind the scenes, but more mainstream stuff like Watergate is obviously not appealing to the public eye.
Yeah. I will. Well, I feel like you know what's interesting? I don't think political participation has actually gone down. I mean, if we look back at the
Political
voter well,
participation obviously goes up with the population numbers, but I'm saying interest in political
yeah,
participation
yeah,
is
yeah.
down.
Well, like I was talking about my reference for how politically active a population is was I take the percentage of Americans that voted throughout the years. And we see that they've been the highest in the 50s and the 60s. They've been the highest. I think they're around 65, 60%.
Yeah.
And then around the 80s, they dropped to 55, where they've remained stagnant, since up to today. Um, I think that what really happens is with the political system is that it begins to serve less people. People start to see less come out of it. And people I feel like people are genuinely confused, and sometimes people may even vote against their interest. And I'm not trying to say that they're like, oh, I'm smarter. I think politics is a very, very broad and very easy thing to get into, and people know what they want. People, hey, would you like this policy? Do you support this policy? They say yes or they say no. And we see with a lot of these, these polls, a lot of people actually they. I know you have your own thing against polls, but I'm just using it as a reference for what I think a lot of Americans think.
I think we can go over polls real quick
Yeah, yeah,
while we're on
sure.
this tangent. So, what I believe is that polls are not representative of a full picture of. Obviously, they have flaws. There's a standard deviation and margin of error for how polls operate, but I just think that polls are inherently biased, and I think that all surveys are inherently biased, no matter how you word them. You can
Yeah,
make
yeah.
it as unbiased as you think it might be, but at its core, a poll will be biased and you will be asking a certain thing for a certain people most of the time. You're not going to ask if we should, uh, I don't know, stop using uh, lethal injections to
Mhm.
farmers rather than urban areas for urban criminals, right? It always pertains to a certain audience, and whether that audience votes in favor of what you're trying to portray is not really representative of the general consensus of the American people, essentially.
Yeah, no, yeah. I think well, I agree. A lot of what you say is true. Politics is not the whole pic. I mean, polls are not the whole picture. I just think that polls, when put together, they can provide a powerful, maybe perhaps a powerful like message, or they provide a powerful picture into the American people.
False
It's very hard
message.
to image. Yeah, it's hard to get every single American's opinions, but most polls are pretty shockingly accurate when it comes to the actual
Nah.
opinions of the entire
If
state.
if
I
polls
mean,
are accurate, Donald Trump wouldn't be president right now.
that is true, but the polls back then didn't include people. There was a lot of new voters in that election that couldn't have been possibly included in the polls, because what the polls do is they take the registered voters from 2012 and they ask them questions, which is why Trump seemed like he was winning. Polls have their flaws, but they can still give us an interesting picture into what the American people want and what they need. And politicians look at these polls; they seriously do, and
Yeah,
that
because
just
they're the
proves that
ones
there's
trying to advocate for what they want, and they only
a,
selectively choose the polls. Do you really honestly think that Donald Trump's approval rating is 51%? You gotta be an idiot to believe that.
No, no, no. I think no. I think it is.
It's
I think we live
not.
in.
There's no
It,
way.
it's shocking. We might not think it is, but if we live in California, where we might live in our own little bubble, where a lot of people are Democratic, but people that vote for Trump, not everyone is the fervous Trump supporter that we see on Twitter or that we might see on the street with the hat and the shirt and with their boat. I think a lot of Trump supporters are ordinary people that, like I said, there's a lot of new voters in the 2016 election, and these people voted for Trump because they're tired of the status quo. They're tired of the same politicians that aren't going to do anything for them. And Trump, unfortunately, abused
Okay, this is
this.
this is too far off. This is too far off. Um, I think ultimately, what I think is that polls just aren't representative of the true American interests at its core, because
Yeah,
polls are selectively uh just picking and choosing who they want to give it to. I have no idea who's doing it. Like a Cambridge poll or like a Harvard poll. Who's doing it at Harvard? Am I supposed to trust Harvard? Is it just because it's Harvard I should trust it more? Like, I have no idea if a poll is accurate or not because of a reputable source. Like, there's no definition for reputable.
no, I know, I understand. I mean, I think just polls are just you call registered voters 50-50 usually. 50% registered Democrat, 50% registered Republican, 10% maybe sometimes 10% independent, and then you ask them questions, and then they ask you certain policy questions. But just kind of, we can go back on point. So we can wrap up the 80s with the conclusion that it was really the time where I would argue, and this is very relevant to my thesis at least, where we see private power officially completely take over the political system. And everything that would happen past the 80s would be almost only in the interest of the very wealthy. And then these people will then influence the politics that we see today and the policy that has actually impacted, whether many people don't realize it, but the policies have impacted us. Maybe
Pretty
some of us are old
much.
enough to they have some of us are old enough to remember '08. These are serious things that happened because of our government. They don't just happen spontaneously. These are things that happened over decades of complete negligence and disregard over the warning signs and whatnot that our government has failed to act upon. So then I guess we can move on with the 90s, and you can go on and
Clinton
give an introduction to.
administration. Yeah,
Yeah.
Bill Clinton. I think a lot of people really only know him just because of the Monica meme. Like,
Yeah.
a lot of people don't really delve deeper than that and just think of him as a scumbag. But you know, honestly, lowest federal income tax in like I don't know 30 plus years.
He balanced
Uh,
the budget.
22 or 25 million jobs. I don't remember. Home ownership through the roof. That's probably you know
And he balanced the budget. That's important too. People, yeah, because
yeah, and
that,
college opportunities for people with the GI Bill. It's or not the GI Bill, but since the GI Bill, a lot of progress was made during his administration, and credit where credit is due, essentially. But
yeah,
the Monica thing was not very good for his image, I suppose.
yeah, yeah. No, you're right. I guess for the 90s, I would say we just see a continuation of what's been happening.
There's not much to talk about in the '90s. I don't think a
Well,
lot of
yeah,
stuff
a
happened.
lot would repeat from the 80s where we see serious issues being suppressed. The quality of life of Americans is, yes, the standard of living of Americans is not the standard of living. I apologize. The wages are still stagnant. People aren't seeing anything from the government still from the 90s. There's true that Clinton introduced some good things, some very bad things as well, but nothing has really. There's the tech bubble of the 1990s that also affected Americans as well. I mean, it's a smaller financial crash compared to
Yeah,
'08, but yeah, these things again happen because of our government, and people are slowly becoming less interested in politics as we go along, as they come to realize that they have less and less of a say of what happens. And yeah, and then I guess we can kind of, I think we might be grossly overlooking the 90s right now, but for sake we should move on to the 2000, I think, where there's a lot more to talk
yeah.
about.
I frankly don't even know a lot about the '90s, nor care a lot about the stuff that happens. I primarily know a lot about the jails and stuff in the '90s and Clinton's happenings in there. So 2000s is probably our best bet.
Hmm.
2001, you have something happening on September 11th, 2001.
Very
Uh,
significant, yeah.
Quite an interesting event and quite a shift in the way we see government. Uh,
Yeah.
Patriot Act, the War on Terror. We get a whole new shift in how our government has taken action in the international scope of things. But what do you think domestically? Other than the
Dome-
Patriot Act, of course,
Other
but
than the Patriot Act, domestically, I think we see a largely a continuation of the deregulation that I've mentioned and the complete, negligence for middle class people. But I think what happened in September 11 is very significant. It was so shocking to many people, and it was twisted and used to to create these wars. And I think what happened, I think the 2000s were very interesting because I feel like in the 2000s what we saw was the closest to the resurrection of what we had in the 60s, because in the 2000s we start seeing people protest against wars again. I mean, we've got to talk about Iraq, very
yeah,
significant, pouring trillions of
on
dollars into
incorrect intelligence reports.
I mean, not just I mean, these aren't just incorrect. I think that's misstating it. These are completely almost lies. Essentially, what the Bush administration did was pick and choose certain intelligence reports. So the CIA would come with them and say, "Hey, there's no signs of nuclear weapons in Iraq." But the Bush administration wouldn't like to hear that. They want to hear intelligence reports of a possibility that there's weapons of mass destruction. And then they brought this to the UN Security Council, which didn't fool anybody. I mean, this is a ridiculous excuse to go to war with a country. Anyways, we go to Iraq, completely destroy a country. We topple a leader, Saddam Hussein, who
Military
we support.
dictatorship, hilarious.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me. No, no, no. I'm not in any way. Let's not get it mixed up. Saddam Hussein was a horrible person, but the United States supported Saddam Hussein before. It was not until he nationalized his oil that we actually went in and decided to invade him and So essentially, it's almost like a mafia doctrine. You know, don't fall out of line. You will serve our
Yeah.
interests, and then as soon as you don't, we will go in and invade you. Again, this is not just American government interest. This is private power interest, which again is close. It's which is important to my thesis because the private power is very much closely intertwined with the government. You can add on to that or bring
So,
up a new.
yeah, the United States took a lot of international action, and I think this is the turning point of the American people in terms of how other people from other countries see them now. Today,
Mm,
we of course realize that pretty much everyone in the world hates us. The United States is such a hated country, but this is where it kind of begins, essentially. The
yeah.
anti-terrorism, the global war on terror, completely demolished any semblance we had in the international community.
Well, we
And
yeah yeah.
yeah, like our standing overall with international on the international community level is terrible at this point, and
Yeah.
the American people notice this. The American people are one being spied on essentially for free
Mhm.
because they were too stupid to understand that the Patriot Act is a terrible idea.
Well,
And
I'm
just because
sorry.
of its crisis, right? The crisis of terrorism allowed the Patriot Act to avoid suppression and be passed with negligence of the American people. And because of this, and of course our global war on terror, right? We finally have a shift in Americans. You know, they don't want to join politics a lot anymore because joining politics means supporting the United States uh, in their adventures outside of the United States and
Yeah.
destroying other countries.
Well,
Being a part of that is not the best image for themselves.
yeah. Okay. Just a few things. I want to bring up 2 points. I think I'm gonna disagree with you for the first time. I think the big disagreement. I think when you call the American people negligent and stupid, nothing like like what I'm trying to
Ignorant, I
say.
suppose, is a better word.
it- yeah, but I think that I disagree with you. I think the American people have been lied to. I actually I have very good faith in the American people because I think if people actually knew what was in the Patriot Act, they would be appalled by it. But the problem is like I said with the corporate media, and this is a serious problem. And this is not like when I say the corporate media, I'm not just theorizing that this is actually you can look up in the number of articles written about the Patriot Act, the type of discussions that orientate around it. But I think it's fair to say that after September 11th, we see a spike in sort of nationalism, and there's a reason it's called the Patriot Act. You know, we're going to take our country back. We've just been attacked. We're in a time of war. You know, we just lost 3,000, I believe, innocent Americans. We're gonna fight back. And but the problem is the Patriot Act, of course, was not in the interest of the American people. Essentially, like he said, it spies on them.
Obviously, and the
And
American
then,
people are too negligent to understand the weight of the act.
well, no, I think people are not. I think first, the people that did not, the people that actually quote unquote supported it don't know what's in it. I would argue because of corporate media. And then secondly, it's important to recognize that there were actually big protests against the Patriot Act, and there was a side that understood the terrible consequences that would ensue. I mean, we can look in Congress and people speaking out against the act. It passed by an overwhelming majority, but still, people spoke out against it, and they were suppressed. They weren't their thoughts weren't listened to because again, it was kind of like it was like this mob mentality. If you have something against the Patriot Act, you're un-American. You know, you don't want to say something now that like we shouldn't do this or that. So the opposing opinions to it were suppressed, so people couldn't make an actual educated opinion, and people still don't know the consequences of the Patriot Act today. Maybe better, maybe now so more than before, but still, people should know about it. And the reason they don't is because again, we had to take a look at our media, which is owned by almost entirely global power and the global interest. I mean, I'm sorry, private interest. But again, that's just my point of the stupid thing. Second, I think this is probably one of the most important things that happened. Like I said, like comparing the 2000s to the 60s, is we talk about this war on terror, and this war on terror was met with resistance, and we can't forget this. Like you say, how the United States was, how its reputation was absolutely destroyed after the Iraq War or even Afghanistan. And the United States was terrible before. I mean, if you look back at Vietnam, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, there was plenty in Turkey. There was plenty of times before 9/11 where we did terrible things abroad. It really went under the radar. I think with Iraq, what happened was people were like, "Hey, this is wrong." And when people stood up and started, we can look back and remember the protests against the Iraq War. These actually had a serious impact upon the policies of the countries enacting the war. They couldn't just do whatever they wanted anymore because the people now was there to check the power of the government. The people said, "Hey, this is wrong. Why are we going to this country? Why are we spending trillions of dollars? You know, this isn't. This is why are we going there for oil? Essentially, this is like it's almost like a well-known fact now, right? That we went to Iraq for war oil. No one else would argue differently. Otherwise, they get chastised. I mean, it's just common sense, right? So this is why I'm going to go back to my thesis now about why people should be more involved because it's another great example of how when people do get involved, when something really brings them out of their chair, makes them stand up, takes them out of their chair, the government steps back. The government realizes, hey, we can't do this. The people are saying we can't do it, and we need the people. At the end of the day, with all the private interest, at the end of the day, even with the private interest, you still get elected by the people, and nothing can change that. We have there's still elections,
Come on, you don't
and when the
honestly believe that the people elect the people
Uh,
elect our
Of
politicians?
course, of course. There's some problems. There's serious problems amongst the voting rights and elections with gerrymandering. We can go into that all day. But for the sake of the discussion, just political participation, people getting out, protesting, speaking out against it, and they're speaking out so much against it that not even like the media could suppress it. I mean, this was like it was so blatant. It was so obvious what the what was happening, and across the world now, especially in Europe, the reputation of the United States and its involvement in foreign affairs is very negative now because of the Iraq War, and there's many studies that prove, well, not many studies, but I think that political participation amongst the American people has actually stopped American from doing as much as it wants in foreign affairs because the people set a precedent that, hey, you can't just do whatever you want because if this war is outrageously wrong, we're going to speak out against it. And I think that's just a very, in my opinion, it was very powerful. And you can
Yeah.
comment on that if you want.
We have to move on because I want to dedicate a large portion of the remaining time to discussing the present and
Yeah,
how politics is today. So do
yeah,
you want to go over Obama's administration real quick and then get into the
yeah,
present, or
yeah, for
um,
sure.
I-
We can we
I'll
can
just start on my opinion on
yeah,
Obama.
go.
Obama was pretty much a pretty neutral president. He accomplished little of what he set out to do. Um, Obviously, his Healthcare Act is his major accomplishment, but closing Guantanamo Bay,
Hmm.
fixing the
Drone
uh,
strikes.
the diversity in America or whatever, that was one of his major ploys, and he was a rather neutral man overall. There's not really a lot I can say in opposition to his presidency or in support of his presidency. I'm actually pretty disappointed he didn't close Guantanamo Bay, but what can you do?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think Obama was like in my huge. I think because we
Eh,
have to remember. Yeah, I mean,
neutral.
no, 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 no. No, I mean, no. I mean, like huge. His message was huge, right? Everyone can remember. I mean, I was a child, and I remember seeing Obama on the television. I'd be like, and I remember like he was so charismatic, and he ran on a hope, and like how can you be against it? Almost. I mean, the things that Obama ran on were so amazing, and of hope, and of a future. And he won by a pretty healthy majority over McCain. And then we see what happened. Nothing was delivered, right? People
Yeah,
got tired. We have this excitement, a sudden excitement. Hey, we have this new guy. He's gonna bring some serious change to this country that is desperately needed because for the past few decades we've been suffering. You know, and then nothing happened.
pretty
And people are
much.
just
I
kind of.
mean, we got net neutrality, and then obviously
I mean,
overthrown.
but yeah, but nothing in terms of like helping people with the economic problems. No serious. I mean, no, don't get me. Obamacare was huge, but it doesn't.
It
Many would
doesn't
still
even
argue.
begin to cover America's major problems at the
Yes,
time.
of course, of course, and this is why people get disappointed, and and especially his second term, he was extremely unpopular. And then I'm just gonna quickly glance over '08 because I feel like it's so important to Obama's presidency. I feel like '08 is really a time where the American people also realized just the power of private interest again. And I keep going back to this, but it's relevant to the why people should be more politically active is because we saw the Occupy Wall Street movements and these protests, and people are, these corporate CEOs that actually instigated the recession, the almost depression, they go off scot free, while tens of millions of Americans lose their jobs, their homes, their livelihoods, and these corporate CEOs, they walk off scot free. They don't go to jail. They if they do get fined, it's nothing. They get handouts from the government. Government doesn't, and don't get me wrong. I think the government should give money when the economy's in a recession. We should bail out some companies, but with actual change. We don't just give $400 million to Boeing. We shouldn't just give $400 million to Boeing and say do whatever we want with your money. No, we're gonna say we want this, we want that. The government has to become involved in the economy to make sure these things don't happen again. In other words, regulation. Because what the companies were doing before is ridiculous, and this is relevant because it's a people thing.
Yeah.
We had these people fiddling with the economy, their little party blow, their little bubble bursts, everything collapsed. Economists tear their eyes out when they look at '08. We still feel its effects today, 12 years later, and everything and then this is the Occupy Wall Street movement. People are sort of starting to now realize corporate power is a serious problem in America, where these guys can get off scot-free without any issues. And that the funny thing is that the banks wrote the bills that they wrote the new bills in reaction to the economic recession. I mean, this is infuriating. The
And
people
dudes
that
from
caused
Goldman Sachs walk off scot-free and keep all their money.
exactly, look, exactly,
It's a
right?
lol
And
funny moment.
exactly, and people see this and like, what the hell? What is my government doing? You
And
know,
then they put their faith in Obama and get pretty burned on it, essentially.
they get pretty burned on it. Yeah, of course, because Obama seemed like Obama. Remember, Obama ran on almost Bernie level promises. With single payer. I mean, with
A
health,
lot of
with
a
the
lot of
universal.
promises, not a lot of action. That's pretty much the
Exactly,
the
and that was
foundation of
and
Obama's
again,
presidency.
and that was the point of his campaign. Obama never was going to implement serious reforms because he was also a puppet of the private power. And that's why we didn't see serious change happen under Obama. And this is where people this is going to lead up to 2016, where we're going to talk about just in a
Big
little bit,
money time.
right? People are just like, hey, you know what? Screw this. This guy didn't do
I'm voting
anything.
for
Do-
Donald Trump.
Trump, yeah, you can go off on 2016 and the present
So
time now.
my
Yeah,
my enjoyment of this topic has no end. I absolutely love talking about 2016 and all the major inner workings of that election. It's simply just a marvel. There's really no way to fully explain how I believe the American people are completely not deceived but disillusioned with their purpose and
hmm yes, exactly.
what kind of country we want to be. Like
Yeah,
we have reached a point of no return in our disillusionment of what American politics should essentially be in only one presidency. It's not
yeah,
even been over like obviously the adding up of certain pressures in certain ways Americans have been grown disconnected from their government. But this is just unbelievable. In a single presidency, we have become absolute animals when it comes to politics, and it's just unappealing to join the political conversation because of this. So
yeah,
let's just start off. Since we're here, and since we're at the present, we can pretty much go over our theses in full at a present uh, time because obviously
yeah,
our theses are most relevant now. So let's go back to why I think that you should not join the political conversation at all. There's no circumstance where I would say you should join politics right now.
yeah,
The way
mhm,
I see it is that the more people join this absolute terrible uh,
climate.
conversation,
Mhm,
the more people that become just disgusted with the practices of our government, of our local levels sometimes, and the stuff that happens off the papers and stuff, or off the
Yeah.
off, what is it called? Uh,
Wait, off the what? Off the newspapers, the news?
Behind the scenes, I'm trying to say,
Behind the scenes. Yeah, yeah, okay.
right? And you have a bunch of just terrible things happening. And that's why I don't think you should join the political conversation right now. But it kind of adds up to how Donald Trump gets elected. Trump essentially won because he got the Rust Belt. That's what I believe, at least. Trump won
Yeah.
because he got the Rust Belt, and I know some people agree with me on that.
Well, of course,
Uh,
he won big swing states. Yes, of course.
Obviously, he can destroy Hillary Clinton in the polls. Not. Hillary Clinton was leading in all your supposed polls, and all signs pointed to Hillary Clinton winning in a landslide victory, but she didn't.
Of course.
Uh,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
why I think the American people seem to be so confused as to how our political system works and why they should join it if the polls aren't correct. Because they believe in the polls, which I think is idiotic. You should not believe in polls because they do not represent the American people's interests.
Yeah. Well,
So,
okay.
yeah, you go now.
Okay, my bad. Okay, I'm gonna stick to my thesis as strong as possible here because I think this is the most important thing that ever happened in recent history, and it's reported very worse. I don't think polls have a I'm not gonna focus on the polls right now. I'm gonna focus more on the campaign messages of Clinton and Trump. Right? Why did Trump get elected? Why did people that voted
Why?
for Obama vote for Trump? Like this actually happened. There was a big switch. I mean, there's many interesting studies and just studies. Sorry, many interesting studies of people that show that people that voted for Obama voted for Trump, and that people that are Democrat vote for Trump, or in the independents and whatnot. And why did this happen? It's because I think that Trump ran on many things that people were frustrated with in the political system. They were tired of the status quo, right? They're tired of this political, I guess you can call it political correctness, where people just wanted someone. People wanted someone that's going to change things. And Trump ran on a message of we're going to make America great again. He ran on the message of, again, he even ran on the message. I would say it's shockingly similar to Bernie, which people would laugh at now. But seriously, like when he says drain the swamp, people hate DC. People know that DC is corrupt and it's flooded with private interests, as I've been talking about throughout this entire conversation. But the difference is that it confuses people again because Trump doesn't actually stand for those things. As a matter of fact, many would argue that
I
Trump
don't
is the
even
most
know what he
corrupt president.
stands for at this point.
Right? Nobody stands for it except certain people. I would argue progressives do. Progressives don't take a dime from private interests. They speak out constantly. They're also outcasts in the political system. But
What,
but
wait, are
again,
you saying that Democrats don't take, or I mean progressives don't take any dimes from private interests? Come on, you can't be fooling yourself with that. It's
no, no, no,
it's
they actually
it's
don't. They don't.
oh, they don't. You're saying that every single progressive campaign at the moment
There are
is
most,
completely
well,
built on
I would say
grassroots campaigns. I find
almost
that
all of
very
them
hard
are.
to believe.
Almost all of them are, and we don't have to talk about all of them. We can talk about just Bernie Sanders alone.
Okay, then
Ran
just let's just
raised
go over Bernie Sanders then.
$400 million from just
Grassroots campaigns.
contributions, right? And this is all documented, of course, and you cannot donate more than a few
Sure,
thousand
but
dollars. There's
every
no private interest because he speaks out against private interest. He wouldn't, and he's been in his entire life, he's been speaking out against private interest. And this is a man that actually would actually address many of the problems American people face today. He wants to give them the things that they've been yearning for decades. They want to live, they want to have wages that are, that are sustainable, that they can live off of. They want to have medical insurance. They want to know that the government is there for them, that when they lose their job, that they won't lose their home, that they won't lose their car, they won't lose everything that they ever had. And I think that Bernie answers those questions. But Trump also similarly he also ran out those things too, which is scary. Again, like I said, he talks about, again, drain the swamp. Bernie also talks about private interests
the
and
silent
corporations.
majority.
I mean, it's all propaganda. He doesn't. It's again. It's almost like Obama. He doesn't actually stand for these things. And okay. And all of that aside, now I think I'm gonna get to my most important thing. I guess my call to action. Going back to my thesis is just kind of bringing everything together. Why should you be participating right now? I think that we can. This is actually. I think that we're facing
A,
pivotal moment
a
in human
crossroads,
history,
essentially.
a crossroads, and not just any crossroads. I mean, people try to hype up presidential elections, but this is serious. What happens in this year in November is gonna forever change the future of not just politics, but of humanity. I think when we look at issues, I don't think I know when we look at issues like climate change, and I think climate change is the most important one. We haven't mentioned it throughout this entire time, but it's been silently happening for the past few decades. And now we're at a point where if we don't take serious action now, that means now that we are going to face catastrophic environmental disasters and massive, and I mean massive migrations in across the world of hundreds of millions, even maybe a billion people by 2050. What we do today will impact what will happen in our lifetimes in the following few years, decades. And and this all goes back to the ballot box now. Should you vote this election? And I think that the obvious answer is yes. I don't. I am coming from a leftist progressive person, which I've constantly been reaffirming this throughout this entire conversation. I'm gonna go out and vote for Biden because although Biden is far from my ideal pick, and even though he is very much a status quo politician, I feel like he is definitely someone that will take more serious approach to climate change. I frankly trust Biden where he's actually going to do it or not. I can't be entirely sure, but I know Trump is not going to. And I feel like Biden's proposals will actually maybe help working class people more, which have been completely disenfranchised. I'm not disenfranchised, but completely manipulated and completely neglected throughout the past 50 years. So we have to seriously understand what is at stake here. And it is true that maybe in California, because of the electoral college, your vote might not count as much. But if you live in a swing state, your vote is really valuable, and you should exercise your vote. You should even, I would say, you should go out and protest. You should try to talk. We should like what we're doing right now is democratic participation. We're having a podcast. We're talking about things. These things are not being talked about enough. We don't talk about climate change. It's rarely mentioned in the news. Like here, I just opened the news. There's not a single climate change article. No one's talking about it. It's happening behind the scenes. What the news is talking about is what Trump said is outrageous or not. We're not talking about the serious issues, which is that what our choices now are going to impact the future of not just our children, but of us. The just the economic and human cost of climate change is going to be so dramatic that we're just going to be completely blown out of the water. And that's why I think that that's why I think you should be more politically active, at least at least at the very least, at least in climate change, and understand its consequences and and the effects of it and why it needs to be addressed seriously. So yeah, you can go off.
So, yeah, allow me to refute a lot of what you said. I mean, I'm not going to go fully against you, but I'm just going to
Yeah, yeah,
elaborate on my thesis and refute most of your points because I don't honestly believe in a lot of them.
yeah.
Climate change,
Go.
I definitely do believe in, by the way. But let's just start with your approach to Bernie Sanders. My problem
Yeah,
with Bernie Sanders lies in the fact that his character is in question for me. Oh, sorry.
yeah,
Um, for me, when I my major point back then, uh, when he was still in the race, was I logged on to Bernie Sanders, his website, his campaign website, and the first three words I could see on his website is "We beat Trump." How is
yeah.
that in any
I,
way unbiased or supposed to be self-righteous to the American people when his goal is is so sinister, I think. I mean, I'm not calling him a sinister person. I think the character of that statement is sinister in nature. We beat Trump. Is that really what the president should be going for? Like, is this just a boxing match between Bernie Sanders versus Donald Trump?
well,
That is the ultimate like kind of problem I have with the message of Bernie Sanders' campaign. Sure, he has a lot of progressive ideas, uh, but a lot of times I have to disagree with a lot of things like free college, I like, but and universal health care, whatever. I like the ideas, don't get me wrong, but they just don't seem feasible in today's political climate or how divided we are as a nation that I just don't think any of this legislation could ever be passed, not even with a progressive president like Bernie
Well,
Sanders.
well. I'll say two things. First, I'll just briefly address you saying that things, that they can't be passed. I think that first of all, you have to understand that a lot of what Bernie talks about is popular amongst the American people. These ideas are popular, and
Sure,
and
they're
a lot of
popular, like for a specific audience.
no. They're
It's
popular
not that you
amongst.
can't just generalize the American people. You know how
Well, no,
divided we are.
I'm citing again. I know you have a hatred towards polls, but they're really the only way that we can really truly look into what people think. And the closest thing, and of course, there's leftists and rightist polls, and don't get me wrong, but generally, what many polls have shown is that Medicare for all is popular amongst people,
Yes,
and
it's
that
popular as an idea. I think it's a great idea, but it's
and
just
it's
not
exploded.
feasible.
Well, I can we can have an entire different podcast of why it's much more feasible than our current system and whatnot. But that doesn't matter. What we're talking about is why people should get more involved. And then you mentioned his point against Trump. I've avoided any Trump bashing throughout this thing because I know you have a terrible hatred for it. But I feel like it's very well deserved. Well, I mean, we're talking about things. We're talking about a man that's completely kowtowing to private interests. We're talking about a man who's incredibly corrupt, and I'm like again, like I see these things I throw these words around, and I know people would love to me to get more specific with it, but because this is a short, I mean not a short podcast, but just because of the topic, we can talk about it later. But again, he's doing things that are catastrophic, and they're just gonna ruin our future lives, and again, especially with climate change, and I think that yes, we should run on a message against this person that is destroying our political system and destroying our planet. That's how we have to address it. We have to go head on, and and listen, I hate the liberal Trump bashing, the Saturday Night Live skits of these stupid Trump jokes and whatever, because they don't actually talk about what Trump is doing that is so terrible. Like that's why Democrats partially why they lost in 2016. They don't we didn't actually, they said Trump
Trump
this,
just got
Trump that
free
without
media
any backup.
all day, every day. Free media. I think he
Well,
got billions of dollars in free media coverage. That's just amazing to me how that
who
happens.
who
Trump
who
during the
oh
2016 election, he got billions of dollars of free media
we
coverage.
can talk hours about the media and Trump and the
Yeah, but
relationship.
let me finish my point because you made a long point. I wanna make mine
Yeah, go for it.
elaborate on it a little bit. So back to my point about Bernie Sanders and his message, right? I don't see any reason for an American who's not into politics to get into politics, especially if the majority of people like Bernie Sanders,
Hmm.
according to your polls, of course.
I'm sorry, not like Bernie Sanders, but his policies are popular. They're becoming
Okay,
increasingly
let's just leave
popular.
it at that. His
Yeah,
policies are
yeah, yeah.
popular and stuff like that. But for a person that's not into politics and when they log onto his website, how is that not off-putting to join the political process when, I mean, some people might not care, but I do. If I
Yeah,
was a new person and not into politics, right? And I saw the first thing I saw when checking out the opposing candidate to Donald Trump that is just we beat Trump.
I think you need
Why should I get engaged with a person like that?
well,
And why shouldn't I
two
just
things. Two
automatically vote
things.
for Donald Trump?
Well, two things. Because, well, first of all, I think you should maybe read more in depth about why he says that and whatnot. That's the time. But I think the most important reason why
But
he
what does it
put
say
that
about
there
his
was
character
because
when he just has that at the first thing I see? That's literally the first thing I see. Not his
there's
policies,
a
not
reason.
him as a
There's a reason that's
person.
there. There's a reason that's
There's
there.
a
It's
reason it's
because
there because that's the main focus of his agenda. He wants to
well,
beat Trump and win the election. Isn't that what
and he
everyone
ha-
wants to
and,
do?
he, and they have to. It's not just he wants to. It's because he's doing
He
it.
needs
He
to.
understands what's at stake. But the reason he put that there was not because of just that, but because during this is entirely off topic thing, kind of during the Democratic primary, the biggest this is actually proven by polls. The biggest concern people have with Bernie is that he can't beat Trump because he was quote unquote too far left, and they believe that they need a more
Sure, he can
moderate
beat
guy
Trump.
like
I
Biden.
believed he could. I honestly believed he could.
But
At
exactly. But a
like
lot of people didn't
you know.
believe that. I think Bernie has a better shot against Trump than Biden does.
Oh no, no, really? I'm on full board with you on that one. I didn't even
But
think Biden
again,
would make primaries.
but people didn't believe that. Most Democratic voters didn't. They actually thought Bernie was going to. They thought Bernie was too far left and that needed a moderate person that's going to
At
bring
least
the
he can
both
speak
parties.
English.
Yeah, but but again, like you know what I mean. Like this is my main point. Just kind of like we can take a step back from Bernie Sanders. I think what we're seeing now is a transformation in the political process. We're seeing terrible things happen, but history has been generally very progressive over the past since the
Yeah, but
60s.
that's just called changing of times. Like it's just passage of time, basic knowledge of it. As time progresses, people become more intelligent and knowledgeable of the things around them. It's obvious.
Well,
It's just obvious.
not just that, but people are getting excited. I think this is very
I don't
interesting.
think so. People are getting
No, no, no,
excited
no,
for the
no,
wrong
no, no,
reasons to get into
no. The
politics.
youth are getting excited, and this is very important. The
I
youth are
disagree.
people are voting. No. This is proven by voter
By
turnout and
what?
by
Polls?
no voter turnout, actual documented voter turnout. People or young people are slowly becoming more involved in the political process. I mean, what we see today with all the protests and on these are young people, and these young people want change, and I think a lot of these young
Yeah,
people
but young
have.
people don't know what they're talking about most of the
No.
time.
They do. I
They
think young
don't.
people like no. Talk. Let's take a step back in the
Nobody knows
'60s.
what they're talking about.
No.
I don't even know what I'm talking about sometimes.
Listen, we can get
Yet I still insert myself into topics I have no idea about
and
sometimes,
that's
just
the
to
nature
seem
of politics.
intelligent.
You learn from one another. But people, I think, what we saw in the '60s again was also young people. And again, politics is not hard to understand. People know what they want. People back up their beliefs, and people go out. They're so passionate about what they believe in is that they go out on the streets and they voice their opinion. And this is frankly inspiring. And I think that this new wave we're seeing, although we see this terrible consequences of the Trump presidency, I think we also see this underlying kind of movement that's been started by progressive Democrats that have been ignored for the longest time. And whether what you think about Bernie or not doesn't matter. His campaign reignited some interest into the political. I mean, he did for me. Not to be like not to
Yeah, well,
complain.
for people like me who absolutely despise politics and everything within it, it's not really appealing.
Well, I despise politics too, but I felt like Bernie was someone that came up and he ran on true. He was someone not only
I'm
with a great
sure
track.
those true intentions showed when those three words appeared on my screen.
But again, you have to look what he did before. He stood for things that were so
Yes, he's one
widely
of the most
unpopular.
consistent congressmen in the history of American history. What's your
Yeah,
point? Like,
but
I honestly can't tell you like Bernie is inconsistent in any of his points. He is consistent. There's no doubting that. But a lot of his
yeah,
things are just too unfeasible for me to believe in, unfortunately. So
we should have another podcast about his ideas. But let me like getting back
yeah,
to the main point. Like,
I don't know
but
to any I don't have the correct knowledge to go in
yeah,
depth about
I
his
can go over
ideas,
like
unfortunately.
and I promise, even though I'm very biased, I promise I'll give you the most moderate. I'll give you both sides of the story on many of
We
his
have to move to
proposals.
closing statements anyway. So
Okay, yeah. So you want to go start with the closing statements?
uh yeah, I'll start.
Go for it. Yeah.
Um so the American political process. It's one of the most complicated and intriguing things I can think of, but it's just not worth discussing anymore. Like, I feel powerless in my current position uh, as someone who lives in California, right? And I would, if I could, vote for a candidate that I believe in only. And I have no one to believe in this time, so I'm not voting. I don't think I should join the political process at all. I hate the political process because of how outside the system I feel. I feel isolated from my government. Feel isolated from the people around me that discuss politics because my ideas are so radically different and away from the politics of California that I'm not taken seriously. So I feel like my own ideas are threatened. I'm not as naive or delusional to think my ideas don't matter, and they don't
Mhm.
matter in the wide sense. No one's opinions matter, but it's interesting to have them debated against. But no one even dares go against me most of the time, essentially. And for you, the viewer who is not into politics or into politics based on how you're watching this, it's not as though I want you to forget about politics and feign ignorance for the rest of your life. The point of the matter is that politics is just not worth it. It's just not worth it to join the political conversation and participate in your government because of how much disillusionment the current state of America is in. There is no reason you should even consider joining the political conversation because of how um, diverse opinions are, right? There's nothing wrong with diversity of opinions, by the way.
Mhm.
It's just too hard to co get a coherent opinion on a lot of topics, right? There's no consistency of argument. For example, someone who is against abortion is for the death penalty. I see that a lot. It's completely idiotic, but some people hold that idea sometimes, and it's just inconsistent. For a lot of people, and the people involved in politics are obviously a major cause of why uh, a lot of individuals choose not to join, whether it be politicians or the actual citizens of the country that do not or that are vastly involved with politics are just not appealing to talk to or understand you. Say you're, I don't know, a fascist, right? There's no place for you in American politics essentially if you believe in fascism. And like there are some groups that would probably tell you that hey, you can join our fascist regime over here, whatever, but you're never going to be taken seriously in American politics. You're never going to make it to the big leagues. And it's things like that that hold some people back with certain niche opinions like fascism back from the political conversation and feel afraid to release that opinion because of how backlash and the political participants see that kind of idea presented, right?
Mhm.
That's about it for me.
Okay. I'm gonna my conclusion for my conclusion. I'm just gonna go. I'm really gonna tap back to some ideas that I've been repeating throughout the majority of this conversation. I think it's important to understand that we're kind of on a saddle point in human history, in especially in this year. I feel like we got to look at what's been happening with the COVID pandemic. We have to look at serious problems that will arise if we do not take immediate action against climate change. And we have to transform our economic policies, and we have to transform who they work for. We have to make it so that people become more empowered through these policies, and that we can work towards greater goals. I feel like on political participation, I think I encourage people to read and to see what's at stake this election, and to seriously consider voting, and to seriously consider becoming more active when and I feel like this will come naturally once people realize that the injustices that we faced throughout history that have largely been hidden from the general public, and again that we're this is a pivotal moment in human history. And I feel like, although even me, someone who has serious problems with both candidates, I feel like there's always a candidate that there is we do have a candidate, Biden, with his own flaws, who will address these issues, and who will actually maybe act upon them, because the alternative is catastrophic. The alternative will do nothing. He will continue what he's been doing for the past 4 years. He will continue his management of the pandemic, which has also been catastrophic, in his economic policies. I mean, these are all serious things, and I don't want to tell you how to think. I feel like that's the beauty of politics. You hear from other people, you read for yourself, and you what I want to encourage you is to think for yourself, and to look at things. And I promise you, once you really take a deeper look at what's happening right now, once you open your mind and you read and you understand what's really going on, I think that your your participation and your kind of you'll kind of get a drive that you want to do something, you want change, and this will just come naturally upon you learning these things. So I encourage you to do that, and I think for all the reasons, climate change, economics, and the COVID pandemic, this is an extremely pivotal point in human history, and that's why I think you should be more involved in the political process and vote this upcoming election. That's it.
And yeah, that's gonna do it for this podcast. I'd like to thank you for joining me on this
Thank you.
podcast here, Damian. You can check out his political blog. Is it a political blog or is it encompassing something?
Like I have like economics and politics, so yeah, I guess you
He
could call
covers
it
an
both.
array of things. I will leave the link to his blog in the description here. But yeah, decisions, I suppose. That's up to you. Taking into consideration our points here. But again, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.